Hey folks, and welcome back to another episode of working on this dumb Mini Cooper. It is time yet again to install a water coolant cross pipe along the back of the engine. This is the fourth time I've done it on this car. This time we're going to use OEM parts. My whole life I've just bought parts from AutoZone or Napa, and everything's been fine generally. But I've discovered with the Mini Cooper that OEM parts are very important. I bought non-OEM Vanos solenoids. Didn't work. Had to take them back and buy the BMW ones, and they worked great. Non-OEM valve cover. The PCV valve leaked oil everywhere. So, on at least on certain things on the Mini, and for me, from now on, it's OEM parts. Why this is making a huge difference on this car and not other ones, I don't know. But this time we're putting in an OEM coolant cross pipe. I believe the one that's on it is cracked. It's only been on there for less than a year. These are pretty notorious for cracking, leaking. They basically just press into the back of the water pump when you tighten down the thermostat housing, which is the only thing that holds it in. So it is a little bit involved because it is on the back side of the engine. So you do have to take the intake off. I like to remove the wiring harness because you've got to loosen up the coolant or the thermostat reservoir, which is a little difficult to get to. So let's get into it. It's always a good idea when you're working on your car to unhook your battery. So if you just come in here with a 10mm and pull off your negative terminal of your battery, that way when you're plugging and unplugging stuff, you don't accidentally short something out. So you can see right here, this little pipe right here, that is the coolant cross pipe. So it basically held in with a little clip that attaches to the thermostat housing right there, and it goes across the back of the motor into the back of the water pump. Now, I know that looks nasty. The last time that I did this, I was so sick and tired of replacing this pipe, I thought I'd put some stuff in there to keep it from leaking. And lo and behold, I don't think that's where it's leaking now. The pipe is cracked. So we're going to have to do the whole thing again. All right, the first thing you want to do is crawl underneath the front of the car, and right behind the radiator you'll find this pipe, and you're going to release this clamp with a set of pliers, pull it down on the pipe, and then you will pull the pipe out, but make sure your bucket is ready. Now the first thing you want to take off your cover piece here with these two star bolts here, or Torx bolts. This will just kind of lift up, and then you kind of have to pry these two little pins out, and that will show you your spark plug wires and allow you to remove the harness to pull this piece off. And then you need to peel these little pins back and separate this air pipe, remove this bolt, and then you can kind of lift this piece up and pull it out. You'll remove this bolt and your sensor here, and then you'll take this clamp loose, and then this whole air box kind of sits on a little rubber snap pieces, and you just kind of wiggle it back and forth and pull it up, and you can pull all of the intake out, which will allow you to get down there and get the bottom part of the intake pipe off to get you access down there to the intake. Also, before you take your intake out, you're going to want to remove the PCV valve and the exhaust gas valve that comes through here. So you're going to kind of pinch this and wiggle this back and forth. But this is very fragile and brittle, especially if yours is older. So you're going to be very careful when you're doing this. So on the intake here, there are some bolts in the top part that we need to remove before we take the intake out. We also need to remove this cable here that I have marked in green. But here's our bolts. You've got one here, 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 which I've already taken off. And then the last one underneath the pipe there is very difficult to get to. I think I have to use a 13mm short open-ended wrench just to get that one loose. So you can see it's really hard to get back in there. I can't get a socket or any other of my tools on it. That's the only way I can get it out. Now to get to the other bolt, it's on the underside of the car, and we also have a vacuum line and a bunch of connectors that we need to disconnect before we pull the intake out. So you see the vacuum line here at the bottom of the screen. You squeeze that and pop it off. And then there is a connector that connects to the throttle body that needs to come off. Another connector that connects close to where the vacuum line that goes in, and then this one that's dangling here connects up on top of the motor to the Vano solenoid. And then there is a connector that goes into the EGR pipe that comes from the top of the motor. So you got to take all of those sensors off, which I know it's really hard to see here. It's so tight I can barely get my hands up here. And then right there next to my thumb, that little gray part, that's the last bolt that you need to remove for the intake. So you're going to want to take that out to be able to get the intake removed. Just be gentle and take your time because this plastic will break easy. Just update where we are. I took off the cover here for the spark plugs and removed the wiring harness. You lift these up and the wiring harness connections for the spark plugs pop out, and then the wiring harness is clipped in on these pieces. You kind of pry those off with a screwdriver. And then I also have a sensor here that I had to remove. I had to take off the ground wire, which is held on with a tiny little bolt. And then I unhooked the wiring that goes down here to the oxygen sensors and the temperature sensor. And then there's a sensor here, here, and here, so that I can pull this plastic piece off of its little pins that it sits in and kind of sit this wiring harness to the side, because we have to get in here and remove that bolt and that bolt, and then there's one up under here that you have to take off the water hoses. You basically have to take off all the coolant hoses here to even get to this well. It's very tight. And then once this is loose, you'll pull this off so that you can loosen the pipe in the back. If this is the first time doing this, I would go ahead and suggest putting a whole new housing on it with the new coolant sensor. Again, I would go for OEM. You can check a place like Pelican Parts or Mini Mania, which is where I get mine, and it's typically way cheaper than buying it from the dealership. But if you're going to go through all this hassle, go ahead and put a new one in with the new sensor. The first one, I just use a deep well here. This is one of my favorite tools ever. If you've watched any of my previous videos, that's what our bolt looks like. Put it in my magnet tray. Now, the one underneath. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to this one without removal of the water hoses. All right, I got the first hose loosened up. Pop that off and slide the hose clamp back so I don't lose it. On to the next one down below. And I just got me an impact with a real long extension to reach into the pipe underneath. Get that hose clamp loosened up. Now with those two hoses off, I should be able to access this bolt right here, which is a 10 millimeter. All right, so I used a short extension with my Milwaukee battery socket to pull that out. And now we just have to get the one that's in the back here, which we're gonna have to take some hoses off to even see. All right, so we're gonna take this top one off. I think that bolt is right behind it here. This is the back side, so behind the thermostat and below the other bolt that we removed. You may have to get a pick to gently remove, help get this off, but you don't want to stab the hose too hard and put a hole in it. So your last bolt is right here behind this pipe, and again, it's a 10 millimeter. All right, last bolt's out. I'm gonna stick my little magnet tool here down there to pull that out because it's really difficult to get to. All right, so once we have the temperature sensor housing loose, it will pop off. And then that's what's putting pressure on that pipe right there. Let me point this out. That's this pipe right here. See if I can get my light on it. It's this pipe right here, which is what attaches to the coolant cross pipe. So we're going to pull the pin just underneath there. See the pin? We're going to pull that pin, and there it is. Separate the coolant cross pipe from the water pump housing, and then we're going to pull that back there where all the blue crap is that looks terrible but was doing the job. We'll pull this piece out. Now you got to be gentle, because if this is an older one, this plastic's going to be brittle. This is a cheap pipe, so this is probably brittle too, but there's nothing in there holding it except pressure from that part. All right, so here's this pin on the back. We're gonna reach in and just pull this out. And now, I don't know if I can do this one-handed, but this should separate. And you can see this end's already popped out, and it actually looked like it broke inside. On the tip here, it broke inside here. So we're gonna have to get in there and make sure we got everything cleaned out. But we just need to get this side loose, which I'm gonna have to use both hands for. All right, you can see how the tip of this broke off. And again, this wasn't on here very long, but this was a generic one. This is a Febby Bilstein, which is made in Germany, but I would not suggest buying them. So I'm looking down and I don't see the plastic piece there. I'm gonna get under the car and look and see if I can see it stuck in there or if it just fell out. All right, so here's the new coolant cross pipe. You can see it says BMW Mini Group. Oh, Rolls Royce, cool. Maybe that'll make my car more luxurious. All right, so this part is the part that broke off, which is what holds the O-ring, which is somewhere in my engine compartment now. This part's always the hardest part to put on. You put the pipe in like this and you press this into the back, but the best thing to do is to get a little cup of hot water, set this in your hot water, and then maybe put just a little bit of grease on it. The hot water will loosen, it'll soften up the rubber a little bit so it presses in a little easier. And then this side just goes into the water pump and you put your pin back in. So I just took my pipe here and put some water out of my tea kettle in there to help soften up that rubber. And I'm gonna go ahead while that's warming up and clean out the inside of the water pump and the thermostat housing. All right, so I put just a little bit of lithium grease on the back of that. And you want your bend kind of pointing up. And you're gonna reach in here and try to press that in. May have to push your housing back to try to get it straight. I'm gonna go ahead and put it in the housing here just to help line it up. All right, and we're just gonna press that baby in gently. I may need two hands to do it. All right, so you should see these little bits of plastic pushed almost all the way in when your pipe is in. All right, so that's in, and then I've got it kind of sit in here, but we got to put it back together, put our pin in, and then we can tighten down the water pump. So the pin goes in the top like that, and you're going to want to make sure that you have the pipe pressed in far enough, because there's a groove right here that the pin sits in. If you don't have the pin in the groove, the pipe will come apart. I know from experience. See, I missed the groove there. Might have to bolt that down first and then put the pin in. All right, so I put this bolt back in kind of loosely, and then the one underneath here to get this lined up, and press this around the corner so that I could put the pin back into the pipe and make sure that it lines up with the grooves here. So that holds the pipe in, which just presses this across and holds it into the back of this by pressure and a little O-ring, which is about the dumbest design I've ever seen. All right, so next we'll go ahead and put the bolt in the front, and we'll get these tightened back down, and then we can start to reattach the hot water lines, get all this wiring harness put back together, and then put the intake back in. So for this engine, which is a second generation model in R56, your water thermostat housing bolts get torqued to 71 inch-pounds. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. I've already got the top one there. There we go. And you put the front one in. All right, so the front bolt, the top bolt, and the third bolt, third and final, which is behind that pipe, are all tightened back to torque specs. So we'll go ahead and put our hose back on, pull the clamp up. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and put my pipe back together that I drained the coolant with. I'm gonna strain this and dump this coolant back in, and then top it off with the rest of the coolant I need and bleed the system. All right, so I'm putting some coolant back in and make sure everything is not leaking before I bother connecting the intake and all this other stuff. All right, so I'm putting some coolant back in and make sure everything is not leaking before I bother connecting the intake and all this other stuff. So just behind the green sensor connector there for the thermostat is the bleeder valve. You just put a long flathead screwdriver down there, loosen that up when you're pouring in your coolant, and you'll see the bubbles come out there. And you want to fill up your coolant to the line at the bottom of the seam and wait until there's no bubbles coming out of here. All right, so we're hooking back up the wiring harness here, and we have a lot to hook up. So you have this one in here, which is your thermostat or your temperature sensor. That's green, and it mounts to green, and then you have a little gray one right here. And then you have your camshaft position sensors, your vacuum line, your fuel pump controller, and then down here, we've got another sensor. Got to plug back in, and then you reattach your clamps. These guys, they just kind of push in, and then you pull this down. For all of these, I need to put the ground wire back on and tighten this, put this bolt back on, and then you have your Vano solenoid sensor, or Vano solenoid that goes here, and then you need to plug in your O2 sensor and put those clips back in on the little metal bracket that holds them, and that covers the sensors for the side and front. When we get to the back, you'll notice that we've got multiple sensors here. There's 3 on this loom that hook into various different parts of the intake and the Vano solenoid right here. So we'll have to put those on. And then there's some sensors further down as well. All of these go back onto the intake, and then there's a vacuum line at the bottom. Some of those we can do when we sit the intake in here, and some we have to do from the bottom. Now your intake is a little tricky to get back in here. You have this pipe right here. This comes out of the EGR valve, which connects to this, comes down underneath the intake, and unfortunately there's a bolt right here. It's always a nightmare to get in and out. And then there's a sensor that goes in the back. This thing breaks very easily. This is the second one that I've had, so you need to be very careful with this, and you do have to put this on before you put the intake back in if you've already taken it off. You cannot put it on once the intake is on. So you want to make sure that's good to go. And then we will start feeding it. Put my light up. We're going to start feeding it down kind of sideways, being really careful not to bump or damage anything while I have this out. So we've got the one sensor there for the EGR valve. There's a sensor here in the vacuum connection on the bottom. There's a sensor over here on the side, and then a sensor there for the throttle body. You can make sure you get all of those plugged back in. All right, so from underneath, we have this little green connector that goes into the connection, the bottom of the vacuum connector. We've got this one here, which goes, so this blue one goes into the back of the EGR sensor, which is right there. Reaching it is never easy. All right, and then we have this wiring harness, which has the throttle body and the Vanos. So we need to get that Vanos one up top and get the throttle body controller pressed back in. And then we have the vacuum line. And then you see right there is where the bottom bolt goes in for the intake, right here next to my thumb. And then that should be all of our sensors from the bottom. All right, so when you get your intake pressed back down into this hole and kind of wiggled it back in, you've got a bolt here, a bolt here, one down here, one I haven't put in yet that goes down here, and then the most difficult one to get to, I have to use a short-armed 13 millimeter to get that one down there. Short arm 13 millimeter open-ended wrench. I can't get a socket in there because of this dumb pipe, but the rest of them you can use a socket, deep well socket for with an extension. So once you have all your upper intake bolts tightened down and the one that's underneath tightened down, then you can go ahead and put your elbow in. So you put your elbow back on and tighten down the clamps, and then you can put your air box back onto the rubber pins that it sits on. So you're just going to wiggle that down and press it, and then you can put all this back together. But so you put this elbow on and tighten that clamp down at the bottom, and then you can tighten the clamp one on to the air box itself right here. You put this bolt back in and tighten it down and put your sensor clip back on here, and then again check and make sure that you're tight but not too tight on your clamp. So you'll put your intake silencer back into the hole and then press down and put that bolt back on, and then you can snap the rest of the intake pipe back together by pressing it in here, making sure the tabs are clicked on. Check your bolt here, and then put the cover back on and tighten down your Torx bolts up here at the top, and you should be good to go. Well, hopefully you guys found this helpful. I know that there are lots of people out there. Test, test. Well, hopefully you guys found this helpful. I know there's lots of people out there who are dealing with the same problem. The part's not that expensive, but as you can see, the labor is quite intensive, so you spend quite a bit on labor. But, you know, if you can do it yourself, save you a lot of money. It is a headache. I hope you don't have to do it 4 times like I did, but it is what it is. We'll see you guys out there. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to see whatever video I come up with next. It'll be sure to be car related of some sort. We'll hope to see you guys out there. Take care.